When you think of Antarctica, what comes to mind? Probably a huge, empty continent of ice, right? A pristine wilderness home to penguins, seals, and a few bundled-up scientists. And for over 60 years, that's kind of been the story, a symbol of global peace and cooperation. But beneath that calm, icy surface, a new geopolitical contest is really starting to heat up. So in this explainer, we're going to dig into why the world's coldest continent is fast becoming a new global hotspot.
This image, it just nails the central tension perfectly. Right in the middle, you've got the ideal, Antarctica, as this global commons for everyone. But look at what's surrounding it. All those flags, all those competing national interests, just pulling at the edges. Like the caption says, it's a continent of peace, completely surrounded by ambition.
And that really brings us to the core question we're going to be looking at. For decades, this thing called the Antarctic Treaty has kept all that ambition in check. But what happens when that treaty, just like the actual ice shelves, starts to show cracks? What happens when it really starts to break?
To really get the risks we're facing today, you first have to understand just how amazing the treaty was to begin with. I mean, this was a real truce created at the absolute peak of the Cold War.
The road to that agreement was long. After it was first spotted back in 1820, there was this heroic age of exploration. But heroism pretty quickly turned into rivalry, with nations starting to stake formal and often overlapping claims to the land. The real game changer, though, was the International Geophysical Year in 1957. It was this incredible moment of scientific cooperation that paved the way for the 1959 Antarctic Treaty, which was actually the very first arms control agreement of the entire Cold War.
So what is this thing? Well, the Antarctic Treaty System, or ATS, is basically a web of agreements built on three simple but really powerful pillars. Number one, Antarctica is for peaceful purposes only. Number two, scientific research is totally free and open to everyone. And three, no military activity, period. It essentially turned an entire continent into a global park dedicated to science.
And you can really feel that original spirit in this quote from a UK representative at the time. He called the treaty a self-denying ordinance. It wasn't about what countries could get from Antarctica. It was all about what they were willing to give up for the sake of peace and science.
But that spirit of self-denial, it's fading. Because for all its noble goals, the treaty system has some deep, hidden weaknesses. You could call them cracks in the ice, and they're now being exploited.
So let's look at the promise versus the reality. The treaty promises global cooperation, but the reality is there's no real way to enforce it. It promises science for all, but who's in charge down there is incredibly ambiguous. It froze all the territorial claims, but, well, freezing a problem isn't the same thing as solving it. And environmental protection? That all comes down to the goodwill of nations, which seems to be a resource that's running a little low these days.
So who actually makes the decisions? Well, out of the 56 nations that signed the treaty, only 29 of them are so-called consultative parties that get a vote. This small inner circle makes all the big decisions by consensus, which means any single country can veto a new rule. That can lead to total gridlock, and it silences the voices of many other nations. And this whole issue with the frozen claims led one legal scholar, Gillian Triggs, to call the situation a purgatory of ambiguity. I mean, that phrase says it all, right? The claims are still there, just simmering under the surface. They were never resolved, just kicked down the road, indefinitely.
And here's the crucial point. This is a system without teeth. Inspections, they can only be done by that same inner circle of 29 members. And if they find a violation, there are no set punishments. We saw this play out in the 80s when France built an airfield in a really sensitive area, a clear violation. But hey, the official inspections found nothing wrong. Compliance just relies on a trust-based system, and that trust is really starting to break down.
So you've got this fragile treaty, and now a whole new set of pressures is turning the world's attention back to the south, making Antarctica more strategically important than it's ever been.
So what's driving all this new interest? It really boils down to three things. First, resources. We're talking potentially massive deposits of oil, gas, and minerals, not to mention valuable fisheries. Second, strategic tech. Antarctica's location is just perfect for dual-use satellite systems, technology that can be used for science and for military purposes. And finally, believe it or not, the new space race. Experts think the continent is the only place on Earth where we can realistically test equipment and train astronauts for missions to Mars.
Okay, so this new strategic value has basically created a huge divide between the key players in Antarctica. You can pretty much split them into two camps, those who want to keep the system as is, and those who want to tear it up and start over.
So on one side, you have the status quo powers, like Australia and France. They want to preserve the treaty, focus on the environment, and keep that ban on mining. But on the other side, you have the revisionist powers, like China and Russia. They see the current system as limiting. They're focused on the continent's resource potential, its strategic position. And for them, a weaker treaty could actually be a huge economic opportunity.
This quote from France's former foreign minister really sums up that status quo position perfectly. Keep Antarctica out of geopolitics, save it for peace and science. It's a defense of that original idea. But now, compare that to this. In 2014, China's leader Xi Jinping reportedly said that his country intends to become a polar great power. That is not the language of self-denial. That is the language of ambition, and it sets up a direct clash of visions for the future of the continent.
So what happens when these two visions collide? I mean, what if the treaty actually fails? To figure that out, analysts didn't just sit around and guess. No, they played a game.
The Rand Corporation got a bunch of experts together for what's called a tabletop exercise, basically a strategic war game. They wanted to simulate how different countries would react as the whole Antarctic Treaty System started to fall apart. It was their way of trying to peek into the future of this geopolitical competition.
And their simulation pointed to two likely ways this all falls apart. First, it starts with nations just bending the rules. Conducting resource surveys that they call science, using that dual-use technology, and just pushing the boundaries of peaceful activity. But once those norms start to fade, the system can quickly spiral into stage 2, breaking the treaty altogether. And that triggers a race to the bottom, with nations just scrambling for resources and strategic position before it's all gone.
The single clearest thing the analysis showed was a domino effect. That ban on mining in the treaty, that's the critical firewall. The researchers concluded that once one major country breaks that ban, the floodgates will just open. Other nations will feel like they have to follow, just to avoid being left behind. And that would lead to a super-fast, chaotic collapse of the whole system.
Which leaves us with this final, really critical question. For more than half a century, Antarctica has been this shining example of cooperation, a sign that we can put our differences aside for the greater good. But as the ice melts and these old agreements get weaker, the future is, well, it's not so certain. Will it stay a symbol of peace, or is the world's last great wilderness about to become the very first frontier in a new global resource war?